this got out of hand. We will actually be discussing 36 different Christmas carols, 37 if we include the original text, and this is now my third longest video in word count. Oops, I cannot emphasize enough that this was an accident. The goal was to watch every production and filmed adaptation of A Christmas Carol that is academically notable and like historically and culturally important, as I do for every other piece of disability theater that I analyze on this channel. It just happened that there are genuinely this many major historical and culturally important Christmas carols. And at some point, it did start to feel like I was trapped in a Christmas Carol Groundhog Day, but with the exception of the more than once times I cried from stress of how long this is going to take, I am the most in the Christmas spirit I've literally ever been in my entire life. Like, if time and deadlines didn't exist, this would have been a straight up fun time. I don't recommend it, but it would have been fun. I also took a field trip to visit the original handwritten Charles Dickens manuscript, which is at the Morgan Library in New York City. That is on display until the first week of January, I believe. They do this every holiday season, so go check that out if you're in New York City and that is the thing that sparks joy for you. I learned it was there and I felt like it was my moral obligation to go do that as well, to just commit to the bit, because committing to the bit is what's happening. Anyway, you may have clicked on this just to hear me review 36 different Christmas carols and learn which ones are my favorite. This video is separated into chapters, so you are welcome to skip to that if you want. But I do hope that you will stay to learn a little bit about disability representation and also like pretty much the history of Christmas that's wrapped up in this book as well, which is fascinating. That was an unexpected sidebar. Housekeeping things before we jump in. Hi! I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a disability theater historian and dramaturg, among other things. We talk about all kinds of things on this channel that generally fall under the umbrella of media literacy and critical thinking and finding untold or undertold stories with an inherent disability angle, always with a cool, that happened, now what? Mindset that doesn't point fingers, but instead lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. It's a really great time. I have a playlist of many others, including the Wicked video that I did work on concurrently with this one. I'm filming that video tomorrow, which is one of my wilder life choices, but that is also all linked below if you want to check those out. Also, while you're down there, you can find my source list, the link to my Patreon if you want to support me. I would really appreciate it, and the like and subscribe buttons along with the comment section are all down there as well if you want to support me for free. Any of all of those things will be greatly appreciated, and I would love for you to stick around. Also, for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown just beyond shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a red and green tartan like sort of boat neck dress situation, and then I have this black top hat that I borrowed from a friend and slapped some holly on, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Incredible! So, A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas, a terribly long name if you ask me, was published on December 19th, 1843 and sold out its initial 6,000 copies by Christmas Eve. Charles Dickens wrote the entire novel in 6 weeks to have it ready for publication by Christmas. At the time, he was fairly low on money, so he really needed to get something to do really well. He was quite famous already from his Oliver Twist and the Pickwick Papers at this point, but he also already had 4 children and a 5th on the way. He would ultimately have 10 children, which is too many children, and generally he was not the most responsible when it comes to handling money. He would also, just for the record, dump his wife in 1858 after 22 years of marriage to be with an 18-year-old actress. So that's a thing. Anyway, he needed money. He was thinking about the February 2nd report of the Children's Employment Commission, which tracked information about the effect of industrialization on children. This information completely horrified him, and he had more recently gone to visit a school, which we'll put in quotes, for street children, and was deeply unsettled by the conditions that he saw there. He'd also grown up with a father who spent some time in debtor's prison along with the rest of the family, which Charles would avoid because he was working a job when he was only 12 years old, but this was a deeply traumatic experience for him, so he saw himself very deeply in these street children that he was going to visit. He initially wanted to print some sort of pamphlet propaganda situation, but he ended up writing A Christmas Carol instead. Now, his Christmas Carol would be a runaway success, but he ended up making very little money off of it because he insisted on fancy binding and 8 illustrations by John Leech, 4 of which were colored by hand in every single edition. Also, copyright law was not very strong at this time, so his book was pirated almost immediately, with another company creating an abridged version by the 6th of January for much cheaper and selling lots of it. So it wasn't a monetary success for him, but it was categorically a success. The book would go on to have tons of other editions, and it has never been out of print. By February of 1844, there were 8 theatrical productions of A Christmas Carol happening concurrently. Only one of them was sanctioned by Charles Dickens himself. It also had lots of versions from other authors that can be best described as like published fan fiction. many about what Scrooge's life looked like after the events of the story. Dickens himself would go on to create a 90-minute abridged version that he would go places and perform for people beginning in 1853 and lasting until his death in 1870, something that almost definitely made him a lot more money than the book itself did. A Christmas Carol picked up popularity in the United States after the Civil War, so he then came here and he did a speaking tour as well. It entered the public domain in 1912-ish. It was hard for me to find the precise date, but it has been in the public domain for a very long time, and so the sheer number of direct adaptations of the story is just deeply overwhelming, as we'll find out in this video. And also because of this, there is a noted academic difference between the text and the culture text, the latter being the version of the story people remember that may not actually match what is in the book because the story has expanded far beyond what it initially was meant to be. We'll talk about some of these culture text things when we get to the adaptation section in a little bit. But why is this one Christmas story so popular, you might be wondering? I sure as heck was wondering it. My assumption going into this was just like, this is the one Christmas stage show that exists. There's a couple musicals now, but they're all fairly recent. So every major regional theater does a yearly production as a community tradition that is both very wholesome and pays most of the theater company's bills for the year. Like, that's how I was introduced to Christmas Carol. Trinity reps a Christmas Carol is like the yearly Rhode Island tradition. So we went every year, and I would leave every year and I'd be like, they did a great job. I don't like that story. And then I would go again the next year anyway because it felt like part of the Christmas tradition. So I just assumed that was everybody's experience and that's why it's so popular. Anyway, turns out Christmas Carol created Christmas, so that's why it's popular, and then it became a regional tradition. So basically, Christmas used to be a holiday celebrated with various traditions, such as festivities outside with the whole town and various villages, but then in 1647, Cromwell banned it, because he was Cromwell and that's the kind of thing that he did, and Christmas pies became mince pies, and even in Charles Dickens' day it was still common for people to go to work on Christmas Day. Also, with increased industrialization, so many people moved to the cities that many village traditions died out completely or were not carried over into the cities because people didn't know how to do so. In the 1830s, the Oxford movement, which later became Anglo-Catholicism, began trying to reinstate lots of older Christian traditions, and so we start to see this reflecting on historical traditions that have been lost and trying to create new ones. Also, Victorians were very obsessed with history and historical tradition. They had very little interest in actually being historically accurate or doing proper research, so much of the history as told by Victorians is sort of based on vibes and vibes alone, but they did give it a go. So we start to see older traditions reappear and new ones pretending to be old ones appear. In the 1830s, we start to see holiday wreaths, and music printers began to publish Christmas carols that people buy and sing and play as a part of their festivities. Christmas trees start to become popular in England in the 1840s, along with the Christmas cracker. And the year A Christmas Carol was published is the same year that the commercial Christmas card hit the scene. And here comes this famous author, right, with a Christmas book right around Christmas time, the perfect gift to give. It's also fairly short. The audiobook is only about 3.5 hours, and the nearly word-for-word Patrick Stewart one-man production we'll talk about later is just under 2 hours, so you can read the entire thing in one sitting. It also has a very easy to follow story with a clear moral message, something that was quite popular at the time. And of course it has spooky, scary ghosts, which gives it more intrigue. It was also one of the first stories to include old holiday traditions, as well as include lots of new ones, many of which showed people how to adapt the old traditions to city life. Instead of gathering an entire village, Dickens showed his readers Christmas celebrations that brought together the nuclear family and close friends. A Christmas Carol made the Christmas traditions accessible to an urban industrial society and evoked the childhood memories of people who had moved to the cities as adults. Many traditions we now see as clearly related to Christmas find their roots in this book. The phrase Merry Christmas, for example, is something that had been documented as far back as 1534, but wasn't used commonly until after 1843. The idea of quiet family parties comes from this, as does plum pudding and gifts and various decorations. The word carol becomes associated exclusively with Christmas songs because of this book. It also began to turn the tide on the popularity of eating turkey over goose. And while almsgiving, which is like helping the poor, was a part of very early Christmas before Cromwell, this story firmly connected humanitarian work with Christmas time and the holiday spirit. A Christmas Carol would not be seen as a children's story until the early 1900s, likely due to the next generation of parents who heard the story as children in the late 1800s, wanted to share it with their children, and it likely stayed this way and is viewed as a children's story today because the Edwardian era was one where our modern view of the idyllic childhood exists, as this is during the era of industrialization but directly before the World War, so it has this element of nostalgia and innocence sort of trapped in it, but it still feels like the modern world. Much of what we today associate with children's literature is either from this time or directly tries to mimic the style of this time. And this creates the perfect storm for this story to be a part of so many people's Christmas traditions, so of course this is going to translate over into adaptation after adaptation after adaptation after adaptation. Different pieces of the story also resonate differently as time goes on. We see a very different version of A Christmas Carol appear in the US during the Great Depression than we do in the 60s or in the 90s. We'll talk about that. when we get there. The one other thing that I want to mention now about historical Christmas carols is the first regional theater production of it in the United States was at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis in 1975, and then the tradition was promptly picked up by other theaters across the country. Now, for a brief summary, in case you're not familiar with the story for some reason, which is totally fine, again, I didn't know it until middle school, it follows an old miser on Christmas Eve named Scrooge who hates everyone and everything except gold. He has a clerk who works underneath him named Bob Cratchit, who is immensely poor and treats him pretty terribly. He says bah humbug to all the carolers who come by, and he yells at people who wish him Merry Christmas, including his only nephew, Fred. When people come into his office who are raising charity for the underserved, he tells them that he pays enough taxes to fund the workhouses and the prisons, and those who would rather die than go there might as well just go and do it then and decrease the surplus population. When he goes home that night, he thinks he sees his former business partner in the knocker on his door, which makes no sense because Jacob Marley died on Christmas Eve 7 years ago, but then at midnight the ghost of Jacob Marley appears covered in chains and says that these are the chains he forged in life, and if Scrooge wants to avoid the same fate, he must listen to the three spirits that are set to visit him that night. The first spirit is that of Christmas past, who shows him the school he went to as a boy, where everybody went home for Christmas except for him every year, but we then see the one year his sister, Fan, who's the mother of Fred, comes to take him, and he reminisces about how lovely she was before she passed very young. He sees his time as an apprentice at Mr. Fezziwig's, having a merry Christmas party with everybody else working there and being in love with this girl named Belle, but she later returns her engagement ring to him because he has become greedy and has fallen in love with gold and is no longer the man that she fell in love with. The second spirit is the ghost of Christmas Present, who brings him to lots of different places to see people being merry and in community on Christmas. Side note, if you've ever seen a production where they're like, you know, in a lighthouse on Christmas Eve, or there's miners and you're like, where did this come from? That is in the source material. They then visit Fred's Christmas party where they are playing a game that ultimately makes fun of Scrooge, and they visit the Cratchit home where there are many children and not enough food to go around, but everybody's still happy and still makes the best of it. And while we're here, we meet Tiny Tim, the littlest Cratchit, who walks with a crutch and a leg brace. We'll talk more about him later. During the family toast, Tim says, "God bless us, everyone. It's very cute." Scrooge wonders if the boy will be all right, and the ghost tells him that it sees an empty chair and a crutch without an owner in the shadows of the future. The spirit also shows him two small starving children that crawl out of his cloak, saying that they are ignorance and want, and tells him he must beware them both, and he expresses concern for the welfare of the children, to which the spirit responds, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" mocking Scrooge's opinions from earlier. Now, the third spirit is out of Christmas Yet to Come. It does not speak, it merely points at things. Scrooge sees people reacting in joy to the death of some unknown man, saying that they wouldn't attend the funeral unless there's free food. They're selling belongings stolen from the man's home and right off of his dead body, and he's like, who could this man be? And when Scrooge asks to see tenderness related to some death, he is shown the Cratchit family mourning the newly dead Tiny Tim, and then Scrooge is shown his own gravestone and realizes he is the man everybody is talking about, and horrified, he promises to change his ways going forward. And then he wakes up, he learns it is Christmas Day, he promptly donates lots of money to charity, he gets a local boy to buy the biggest turkey at the market and sends it to the Cratchits as a surprise so they can have enough to eat. He finally accepts Fred's invitation to join him on Christmas, and then the next day he gives Bob Cratchit a raise, and he begins to treat everybody with care and kindness and generosity going forward. And that's it, really. It's, again, not that long of a book. There's lots of little bits that I excluded there. If you're seeing any adaptation and you're like, where do they get parrots from? Or Robinson Crusoe, or the miners, or things like that, if you just go on the Project Gutenberg version of Christmas Carol and you Command F that word, you'll find it. Those things are all in there. He packs a lot into a short bit, but basically it's pretty simple. It's not really that complicated. One thing for the book that I thought was particularly interesting is that there is a very early comment in the first few pages that adds an interesting disability framing to the story that is not really present in any of the adaptations that I watched. It appears like 3 or 4 times maximum, I think, and it's usually abridged when it does appear. But basically it says about Scrooge, even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, Dark Master." This is first of all interesting because we know that guide dogs for the blind have been a cultural phenomenon since the ancient times. I remember pulling mosaics that had images of this for a project on ancient Rome very many years ago, but I don't find it mentioned in literature very often, and it's never quite clear historically how common this actually was. Like, it could have just been a one-off thing that happened to be documented. We don't really know. But this quote being here, without quite explaining the phenomenon more extensively, when Dickens has never been a very concise kind of author, implies that at least in Victorian London, guide dogs for the blind were fairly common, which brings me a lot of joy. Or at least it was very top of mind for him, as he had just come from a trip to the United States where he toured the Perkins School for the Blind. He met Laura Bridgman, who was the first deafblind person to be formally educated. We talk about her in my Helen Keller video. But either way, if it is included in this text, it means that other people also knew what he was talking about to enough degree that he didn't need to over-explain himself and thought it was worth including. And that is something that I think is really fun and really cool. The second reason that I flag this is because this framing is technically saying that it is better to be disabled than it is to be evil like Scrooge. And something historically notable about Tiny Tim's arc, which we'll talk about later, is that he is not cured by the end of the story, he just survives, which I'm not going to say is incredibly progressive necessarily, but it also is more progressive than, say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame from just over a decade prior, where the disabled character yearns to be cured and then he dies instead. And just about every other disabled or physically non-normative character in Gothic horror from around this time period is either killed or cured at the end of the story, which is a trend that still continues to this day. This quote could also set up a dichotomy of evilness and goodness that places all disabled people as inherently good, which is another thing we might see with Tiny Tim. It really depends on what Charles Dickens thought about disability, which we don't entirely know. It also shows blind people being functionally independent and able to be out and about living their lives, which offsets this idea of like disability as fragility and isolation, all things that I find quite interesting. Much to say on the matter, more will come later, but let us start with the age-old question. What vague unspecified illness does Tiny Tim have? Now, the text tells us that he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame, and later notes his withered little hand. And obviously, he's tiny. It's never made expressly clear if that means malnourished tiny or this child is very young. I would argue, given the era, probably both of those things concurrently. It seems to imply that he is the youngest of the bunch, or close to the youngest of the bunch, and him being the baby is what is fairly consistently portrayed across adaptations. It's also notable that he is not in any of the few illustrations in the book. One paper that I read spoke about this being indicative of an inherent anxiety around visually portraying disability. I don't know if that's particularly fair of an analysis, given that one of the illustrations shows the emaciated ignorance and want from underneath the ghost's coat. So if it wasn't afraid to show that, I would imagine a little boy with a crutch is not any more of an issue. The choice of what is and isn't illustrated seems a little bit odd to me. It's weird images that are chosen because some of the images not included feel more important to the overall story than the ones that are included. But that's beside the point. Either way, having an illustration may have been helpful here, but he is described so clearly that I think we can kind of do our best with what we've got. There are multiple medical papers that imply with great confidence that Tiny Tim clearly had polio. If I may get a little frustrated for just a hot second, polio is a comparatively recent disease, and I really need us to stop saying that every case of potential paralysis or mobility issue in history is polio. 9 times out of 10, it's not. Our first major outbreak of polio in the United States was in the 1910s, and the first major outbreak in England was in the 1940s. Technically, the disease has been around for quite some time. It was first described in 1789, and there are some small references to what we now know might have been polio from before that time, but it is highly contagious, so a one-off random child in a city having polio in the 1840s and nobody going, is this a new disease I should be investigating? Makes little to no historical sense. So if we see something that has to do with paralysis in this time period, or seeming paralysis, it's not polio. It just isn't. If you're looking at a symptom profile of a child who has issues with walking and mobility before the 1910s, especially if they are poor, especially if they live in the city, it is rickets. With the exception of Crutchy from Newsies, who definitely got run over by a trolley, but frankly, he probably also concurrently had rickets. But in every other case, it is going to be rickets almost assuredly. Rickets is caused by a vitamin D deficiency in children and causes the softening and distortion of bone, which can cause things like bow legs, unevenly grown legs, and weakness when walking. It can also cause brittle bones, which are more easily breakable, and for a poor family, they may not be able to get those bones set properly to heal, so it might heal in a way that makes mobility difficult or painful. And the aspect of the withered hand could also very easily reference malnourishment. In this era in London, it is estimated about 60% of children had rickets. Again, there wasn't a lot of sunshine for them to get vitamin D, nor was there a lot of healthy food for them to get vitamin D from, so vitamin D deficiency was kind of just 60% of kids had it. At this time, about 50% of children in London also showed signs of, say it with me class, tuberculosis. If you're not familiar with tuberculosis, there's lots of different kinds, and some can affect mobility, such as spinal tuberculosis for an example. And that is a thing that Charles Dickens' nephew, who was often cited as the inspiration for several of Dickens' characters, did have. He was 5 at the time of writing A Christmas Carol, so that is the age Tiny Tim is in my brain. Henry Augustus Burnet, also called Harry, for some reason, you're going to see both names used interchangeably in the limited sourcing that is available on this child if you look into him. He only lived until age 9. Unfortunately, he passed shortly after his mother, Dickens' eldest sister, Fanny, who died of tuberculosis herself. I wasn't able to find very much contemporary information on this child beyond a letter in which Dickens wrote about visiting Fanny as she was dying and saying she spoke about an invention she had heard of that she would like to have tried for the deformed child's back. And there's a portrait of him that doesn't really give us very much information, but it does exist. Peter Ackroyd in his 1990 book Dickens talks more about Henry more anecdotally. Fanny's son, Henry Burnet, was a weak, crippled child upon whom Dickens had actually based the character of the ailing Paul Dombey. At At least this was how Fanny's pastor, a Reverend James Griffin of Manchester, told the story. Harry was a singular child, meditative and quaint in a remarkable degree. He was the original, as Mr. Dickens told his sister, of little Paul Dombey. Harry had been taken to Brighton, as little Paul is represented to have been, and had there, for hours lying on the beach with his books, given utterance to thoughts quite as remarkable for a child. Perhaps Harry, who had been born in 1839, had also suggested to his famous uncle the character of Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol. Tiny Tim did not die while Paul Dombey did, of course, and it seems surprising that Dickens should decide to slaughter a child based upon his own ailing nephew, yet it was fiction. Only fiction. I think that critique is interesting because he also killed off Fanny before Fanny also died, so why didn't he mention? Anyway, I think overall, based on the historical record, we can safely assume that Tiny Tim probably had a combination of tuberculosis and rickets. He also could have just been born with a limb difference or something else congenital, but it does sort of insinuate that he is sick, so this leans me more toward an illness situation than a congenital difference, but that could also factor in here. You never know. In the adaptations where they choose to cure him, logistically, that would have to be more on the rickets side because that was a fixable thing via vitamin D. Not that your bones being a problem can be permanently fixed, but at least get healthier, get better, versus tuberculosis being something that didn't really have a concrete treatment until the 1940s and is often progressive. But anyway, beside the point, the central discussion in most of the literature around Tiny Tim is that he is a narrative prosthesis, or a narrative prosthetic, a disabled person who exists solely to prop up the character arc for the main character. And within this umbrella, he fulfills the sweet, innocent trope, a trope of a disabled character, either child or infantilized adult, could be both, whose only personality trait is the disabled one, and who exists to spark some strong emotions in the main character, who can then feel better about themselves when they get the chance to save the disabled one. They also often don't behave like actual human people and speak at developmental levels they simply are not at yet. Tiny Tim is basically an angel child. He's a fantasy idealized disabled child, uncomplaining, selfless, small, utterly unreal. This is the point of him, of course. He's a dramatic device, literally designed by Dickens to deliver the maximum emotional punch. Dickens represents him as a symbol of neglect in Victorian society rather than as a fully developed individual with specific needs. A Christmas Carol frames people who are struggling as tragic victims in need of rescue by the main character, which makes sense because the overarching political desire of this work is to get rich people to support the needy. That is why he wrote it. So he does this by creating characters that tug on people's heartstrings to get them to change their behavior. This is also not the only time he ever did this. Many of his other Christmas stories also include disabled characters. It's also going back to Tim speaking like a tiny adult who's way too wise for his years to make the adults feel better about themselves. It is notably odd that he is self-aware of his own ability to teach a moral lesson, described by Bob Cratchit. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. It's like he wanted to be inspiring to people and feels like that's his only purpose in the world, which is either really strange and or it's just too heavy-handed on the part of Charles Dickens. Really could be both. And now, while I don't disagree that Tiny Tim is definitely a really great example of this trope and that these things are issues narratively, like those things are stereotypical and ableist and that is bad, I'm also me, so I'm going to look at this practically as well. I think we can say that the story is an issue today because this trope is literally everywhere all the time and we don't have a lot of other types of representation in media. In fact, we could say the same thing all the way back to the early 1900s where this trope of disabled characters in major books at the time was really, really common, and most of the disabled characters that we get are in the Tiny Tim kind of lens. But I haven't really been able to find literature with Tiny Tim-like characters existing before Tiny Tim. Hunchback has some similar vibes to it, but they're very different in many ways. So as I read all these articles talking about Tiny Tim being a cliche, all I could think about was how everybody says Christopher Boone in Curious Incident is uncreative and derivative because they don't realize that historically he is the first and all of the derivatives of him came after. Very similar situation to The Fault in Our Stars, where everybody hates on John Green for a genre that I guess is technically because of him, but it's not his fault. There's other flaws with that book. We've gone into that before. Don't get me wrong. But base level, that's a more modern version of this phenomenon. And I don't think we really realize how much Tiny Tim himself influenced the culture that came after him. We tend to think of this story in a giant pile of old-timey stories starring sweet, innocent, perfect disabled children that are there to tug at our heartstrings, because in our brains, the 1800s and the early 1900s are the same, year, which is not how that works. But the more that you look at the fallout from A Christmas Carol, the more it kind of looks like he created this mold himself. After A Christmas Carol took off and everybody was doing their illegal productions of it and reading their genuine versions or their pirated copies, there was a notable increase in charitable giving around Christmas. There were also new hospital wards created all over London and elsewhere via charitable funds that were named the Tiny Tim wards. Hospitals would have designated Tiny Tim beds. The Queen of Norway sent annual presents to disabled children in hospitals, and they were signed with Tiny Tim's love. So I don't think it's a stretch when we say that, the disabled children on the March of Dimes fundraising posters are literal direct descendants of Tiny Tim, because clearly the image of a sad little saintly disabled child brings in donations. And honestly, who can blame people for not like using that visual going forward? It doesn't mean it's still super ableist and it's a problem, but I do follow the logic, right? And I think given that context, it makes sense for us to look at Tiny Tim and feel very objectified and infantilized, because that is what his image and iterations of his image have come to mean over the last 100+ years, which is sort of why I'm attacking my feelings on this disability from kind of two sides. Because if we go back to Victorian London, this era is actually the beginning of disability as a social category. With the rise of capitalism and industrialization, there needed to be a designated group of people who could not work to differentiate them from the people who would not work. Those who could not were meant to get social services and help to, support themselves, which went poorly then and goes poorly now. But this is where disability comes from. If you cannot work, or you can, but with not enough efficiency for it to be worth it for the employer, you are disabled. If you have a disability but you are able to work, you are not disabled. And this was set out in the legalities of the Poor Laws, which Scrooge outright mentions as being where his tax dollars are going. And previously, accommodation was a lot more commonplace because people were more likely to be subsistence living or doing more freelance things, and now there was this focus on standardization and efficiency, and thus the group of non-standard bodies became inherently larger. This era also created more disability because of the new technology like machines and mining. All these things were extremely dangerous, and we also see people flocking to cities to work, places that are dirty and unclean and smoky and don't have a lot in the way of sunlight and healthy food. And of course, those who were poorer would do the more dangerous jobs, which would create a further cycle of disability and poverty. But this means two things. First, the social situation of this time and increased commonality of disability created a lot of things that political-leaning people wanted to talk about because it was such an issue. And second, that because so much was changing at this time and physical ability and conformity was becoming increasingly important in cases of employment, it became something that was a lot more top of mind for people. And so we see issues related to disability begin to appear a lot more in the literature of this time, often around questions about bodies that are different and what happens to people who are different. Again, see all of gothic horror as a genre. This also concurrently created a great environment for the rise of the golden age of the freak show, where visibly disabled people and racialized people and intersex people and anybody who was different were put on display for everybody else to go, I don't fit in, but at least I fit in more than that person does. And I think what's notable about A Christmas Carol to me is that Tiny Tim doesn't really fit into this kind of narrative around disability as much as everything else that I know and love, begrudgingly love, from this time, which when you hold it next to all of these other ones, using disability as metaphor to explore the idea of difference, makes this feel a lot more grounded and real and deliberate, actually. And that doesn't excuse its issues, because its character is being used in a different way, and to some extent he too is a metaphor just for how capitalism leaves the most vulnerable behind, but it feels different enough from the narrative norm for disability that I associate with the 19th century that it almost feels fresh and new to me. And again, the fact that he is neither cured nor killed at the end of the story, he just continues to live as his disabled self, is very interesting and very different. The cure or kill trope is usually noted as being utilized so readers don't have to feel uncomfortable about what's going to happen to the disabled person in life, because the colloquial understanding is that typically it is better to be dead than it is to be disabled. So it's very rare that this didn't happen to Tim. He just simply is. And that's enough, and I think that that's really cool. Now, a bunch of adaptations do choose to change that, but it's fine, don't worry about it. What's also notable to me about Tiny Tim is that unlike many stories before and far more stories after, he's not hidden away as a secret disabled person watching longingly from the window or sitting alone in a garden. He's out and about with his crutch and his brace, living his life, which isn't all that atypical for this era. Again, everybody had rickets and or was missing some appendages from various equipment issues, but in the media canon, it's not super typical. Also, on the note of cure or kill, I also read some articles on Tiny Tim that talk about him in relation to eugenics and social Darwinism and how he's clearly related to this narrative. And I hate to be that guy, but Darwin's On the Origin of Species was not published until 16 years after A Christmas Carol was, and the idea of eugenics is long after that. So there is this idea that pops up in the text about decreasing the surplus population. This is something that's attributed to Thomas Malthus. As far as I can understand, it seems like the specific ableist connotations around these ideas did not appear until the survival of the fittest situation hit the scene long after Tiny Tim. Malthusian economics is more focused on the general, we need less people, because if there's too many people, we're going to succumb to famine and disease, rather than these are the specific people that need to go. I think we can do better in, being aware of this extra connotation that these specific lines and ideas take on in a current version of the story now that eugenics is a thing, but the original intention of this idea was nothing of the kind, as far as I can understand. I went into this research process kind of expecting to get a lot from every paper that I read. I overall found that a lot of scholars really just need to Google dates of when things happened and or were created, because it was a consistent problem throughout most of the literature to the point where it almost undercut the ideas of the rest of their arguments, but I digress. I don't think that we can say Tiny Tim was revolutionary, because he was always used as a plot device to further a particular particular narrative, and that has always been a problem. I also think this view of a disabled child as being more of a tiny adult than as a child is a problem, and probably did a disservice back then as well. But at the same time, this is also around the time where socially the idea of childhood rather than children just being tiny adults was becoming more accepted. And there aren't enough other children in the story for it to be clear whether Dickens believed Tim specifically was adult-like and the rest of the kids are just kids, or if he understood all kids to be like this because that was what the common belief was at the time. So I'm a lot less harsh on that particular critique. Obviously the plot device does continue to remain an issue, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to say, I mean, I guess Tim himself, and by extension Dickens, is technically responsible for all of the poor, sad, disabled poster children for charity in the next 200 years following this book, but I don't think it's fair to blame him for what everybody else decided to do with him and his image after, you know? Like, narratively, for this time period, it's not my favorite, but it's fine. Narratively, for our time period, in complete isolation and pretending that there are tons of other diverse kinds of disability representation currently available, it's not my favorite, but it's fine. Narratively, in the context of what our current landscape looks like, this scares me a little bit, because there is a very real world where people all over the country only see one disabled person in real life a year, and it's Tiny Tim. It could definitely be argued that this is the most seen disabled character in all of media, but something just feels wrong to me about blaming him for being a cliche. Maybe I'm just like protective of this non-existent little child, but some of the articles I read were so harsh, and I was like, he's just a little guy. I did read one very interesting paper titled Because He Was a Cripple, Collective Care and the Theory of Complex Embodiment in Dickens' A Christmas Carol that had a more expansive view of disability in the story, and specifically noted, contrary to the tendency of disability scholars to conclude that A Christmas Carol leans too heavily into the trope of inspirational disability or diminishes disabled agency, Dickens' incorporation of disability actually extends far beyond Tim, as each member of the Cratchit family is disabled by the actions and inactions of Ebenezer Scrooge, and thus presents a rich conversation about the embodiment of disability. This paper talked about how Tim is not the only disabled figure in this story. Poverty is inherently disabling to this family. Like, they're unable to afford enough to eat, and thus they go to bed hungry, or how they, including some of the children, are forced to endure horrible working conditions just to barely scrape by, which means that those children are unable to obtain an education. It is also likely poverty itself that is the cause of Tim's physical disability, at least the vitamin D portion of it, but also potentially the tuberculosis portion of it as well. I also read an article that critiqued A Christmas Carol in saying that there is more focused on Tim being disabled than on him being a child, which got me thinking about the discussions of autonomy and how there have been recent conversations about childhood itself as disabling because of how disempowered children are. And I think this was, again, a bit different given Victorian views of childhood, but in reading this story, I never felt like it focused on one thing over the other. If anything, it didn't talk about any child behaving like a child at any point in the story beyond them being like, feed us dinner, and like, that's kind of it. The general argument that this character doesn't have any character traits or a character arc and this is a problem is also interesting to me, because he's about as flat a character as most of the other primary sources in this story are. Nobody has a character arc. Scrooge is the only in-depth one, and even then he's very close to a narrative archetype himself. It's a very simple story. There's not a lot going on with really any of them. I again think there is some issue with Tim himself being functionally a plot point, but I sometimes feel like the criticisms of his character come from other versions of the trope that don't really acknowledge the context of this specific piece, if that makes sense. I don't want it to seem like I'm defending Tiny Tim or saying this narrative isn't ableist, because it is, and there are things to critique, but I don't think that it's like the cardinal sin of literature or the worst thing to have ever happened to Christmas, which is what I feel like a lot of this literature seems to imply. It makes me feel weird in the modern day because of the social context we now have around it and these general ideas, but also a lot of the issues with this character are just because the book is short. The thing we're actually mad about is how this is portrayed in the current day and age without any thought as to what an updated and more nuanced version of historically accurate can even look like. Tim starts to look like he has zero character traits when he gets put on a screen or on a stage, and you see all these other performers put a layer of depth into their archetypal characters beyond the very little that, again, they too also are given on the page, so then he looks flat by comparison. And we're sort of at a point now where everybody is so used to this flat version, so if further depth is added to it, it's very rarely noticed by audience members who are just kind of here for what they expect. I also want to note, I'm not going to go into this in the adaptations because I don't think that's fair, but like, when we're casting tiny children to perform this character, they're not adding character depth because tiny children mostly, the majority of tiny children you find are not very good actors. That's fine because they're 4. Like, you can do that, that's fine. But I do think that's also going to flatten this character, right? Because it is so little and it's not able to act that much because they don't have a lot to work with, A, and B, most of the time they're just kids reciting lines who look cute. And they're allowed to do that, and that's totally fine. But that is just a thing that we should also be acknowledging. To be clear, I have seen some Tiny Tims who were fantastic actors. I have seen just as many who were just adorable, and that's fine. but that also does impact how we are viewing this character and the level of depth that we are looking at this character. But if we do deliberately add this depth and figure out how to do that with teeny tiny children actors, and we add a more obvious conversation about it so that is received differently, I think this honestly might fix a lot of the issues at hand. Not all of them, but a good chunk. I also want to talk briefly about Scrooge is disabled because that is something that pops up in various adaptations, which we're going to get to in a second. We're almost there, I promise. Many versions have him hunched over and walked with a cane, presumably to illustrate his age, which in and of itself can be an ableist idea, and that, you know, images like that are used to narratively imply a person is out of touch with the world around them and that they're lonely and miserable, is a thing to note. But this is also an image that is associated with colloquial understandings of the miser character, often with the goal of showing mental crookedness via physical crookedness. I cannot pinpoint specifically what adaptation or adaptations did this, but I do know that I have seen at least 2 versions where he is bent and using a cane and moving slowly, but then when he decides to change his behavior and save himself, he suddenly like throws away the cane and he no longer seems to have any mobility issues, which is not great. There's also a mixed message in visual storytelling around Scrooge as a miser with his nose. Often we see Scrooge animated or drawn as having a slightly long and hooked nose in a way that combined with a miserly trope can sometimes come off as anti-Semitic, or be deliberately so. Looking at the original illustrations, it does look to me to be a longer nose as a way to denote age rather than as like the visual narrative used to denote sin, specifically in Jewish men. That was not uncommon at this time. Also, obviously the focus on celebrating Christmas and everybody around him and related to him doing so has a particular non-Jewish implication, but there are some adaptations where the visual storytelling does feel a bit more dubious. And this conversation is very complicated. We had it a couple times when I was studying Commedia because Pantalone, one of the miser archetype characters who is Scrooge in the Commedia script version of the story, actually has a very long hooked nose, which I was told references age and crookedness, but given the time period and the images and media at the time of Jewish men, it feels a lot more complicated than that. Hence why I wanted to mention this here, because I think that's something that I think we'd all rather production not do by accident. The one other canonical disability thing with Scrooge that I think could be an interesting but morally difficult option is an autistic interpretation of this character, which a couple adaptations have inadvertently done, where it's less that this man is outwardly, I hate people and they should all go die, and more, this is how things work. I see the world in nickels and dimes. I don't like my routine being changed or these loud carolers outside my window, and I get overwhelmed in social situations. It doesn't entirely work all the time because we see in his young childhood that he is more of a community-based party child and he's at the Fezziwigs, but it could be like that specific environment was accessible to him or safe to him, and after the fact nobody else kind of was. Or he got caught up in the wrong crowd and that reinforced rigid thinking patterns that weren't as highlighted at that time in his life. There are ways to play this that would be interesting. I think there's a significant risk in taking a character that is fundamentally a crooked villain for 90% of a story and humanizing that via the use of a DSM diagnosis. This is something I think, if it does happen, should only be done under the watchful eye of a disability dramaturg and for a very specific audience, but it is something that easily maps onto this character that I do find interesting. But we will return to disability-related ideas in the conclusion bit. One other thing I did find interesting that was noted somewhere that I can no longer remember where, is that Dickens' political views with this story are less the system is broken to disenfranchise poor people and more we need to change how the rich go about aiding the poor. No further commentary on this, I just think it's an interesting thing to bring up. He did also try to put his wife in a mental institution, so some systemic things are just fine when they're beneficial to you sometimes, even if you don't like other parts of them. But okay. We're gonna go in chronological order. I will also mention that I was able to find all of these with the exception of 2 that I had to rent, and of course the ones that are only available in the special archives, fairly easily for free in various places online. I'm all about accessibility, so I figured that information was worth including. The only 2 that I had to rent that were not archival were Spirited, but Spirited is on Apple TV, I just don't have Apple TV, and the Michael Arden Jefferson Mays production, which I had to rent off of Amazon Prime, but the rest of these I was able to find mostly on YouTube. So if that's helpful, go check them out. The overall lessons that I pulled from this bunch of Christmas carols is that most adaptations stick pretty tightly to the source material, and with the exception of a handful of things often added in the culture text, don't seem very inspired by others either. Like, normally when I watch a lot of something, I can see the specific historical through lines that slowly add to a piece over time, how it grows, and this did not have anything concretely to that degree, which is interesting. It was also frustrating. The most major differentiations from the source material are changing the names of Belle and Fred. They get changed a lot of the time. Fred is sometimes engaged to the woman he loves but can't afford to marry her, or they're married, it depends on the version. Sometimes Tim is healed at the end. I'll note that when it comes up. Sometimes Scrooge goes to the Cratchits directly rather than sending the turkey and seeing them the following day. And sometimes Fan died giving birth to nephew Fred, presumably as an added motivation for Scrooge to dislike his nephew. That doesn't pop up that often earlier, but then once it does pop up, it kind of just continues to pop up for the rest of the adaptations. This story was also left completely untouched by the Hays Code, so we do not have any weirdly censored versions of it either, and nearly every adaptation, I didn't keep track of this till about halfway through, includes God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen as its primary carol. That song is never mentioned in the source material. I don't know why this is the go-to carol. I didn't even notice it until about halfway through because it's the only one I had stuck in my head, and I was like, why? And I realized it was in like all of them. The other thing is that this story is unsurprisingly incredibly white. I think the first time I noted a person of color in an adaptation was in the late 80s. It genuinely did take that long. And interestingly, of the only main principal characters, which to me is Scrooge, Marley, and the Ghost, the one that was really ever a person of color was almost exclusively the Ghost of Christmas Present, who was pretty consistently black for about a decade or so, and still kind of is even today. And that was also the most commonly gender bent of the three ghosts. And that is interesting to me because that is the one that is the most sassy and pointed towards Scrooge of the three, which feels deliberate to make that one a woman and or a black woman. But anyway, let's dive in. Adaptation 1. This is the British-made Scrooge or Marley's Ghost from 1901. This is the earliest surviving film adaptation. It's silent, obviously. The editing is really impressive for how new film was as a medium at this time. I was very impressed. The ghosts, they seem very ghostly. The runtime is about 5 minutes. Tiny Tim does not exist as a character here. Visually, there's a small child who has a crutch that is part of this family that we see, but that whole section of the narrative is cut entirely. So that's it on that one. Number 2 would have been the 1908 film, but that is a lost media, so it's the 1910 film instead. This one is just under 11 minutes in length. It is the first made in the United States, specifically trademarked Thomas Edison for anybody who's interested in film history. Again, the Tiny Tim narrative is cut here. We just see him in the dinner scene. That's it. I will note that this version of him is very active and behaves like a typical child. I'm a big fan of that. The Scrooge walks slightly hunched and he uses a cane. Number 3 is the 1913 British film starring Seymour Hicks. This one is about 40 minutes long. It was released in 1913 under the title Scrooge and released in 1926 in the United States under the title Old Scrooge. It framed the story as a sort of cautionary tale saying one should take this lesson to heart and began with a little bit of historical information about Charles Dickens and an image of his birthplace for some reason. I thought that was fun. The Scrooge, he limps really heavily. The Tiny Tim is also very active and behaves like a child should. I promise we'll get to my opinions of these pretty soon beyond like the perfunctory information. I just felt really neutral about all the silent film ones. 4 is the 1922 silent film. It is an 18-minute film. I was only able to find 10 minutes of it, which was enough because it doesn't have Tiny Tim, so it doesn't really matter. I was expecting to get like strong ableist stereotypes from the silent films because silent film was known for overdoing visual cues like disability for character purpose, so overall a surprise. He doesn't really exist until the 1920s. The first radio broadcast version was by the BBC in 1923. That is lost. So adaptation 5 is the 1935 Scrooge, starring a now much older Seymour Hicks. This is the first one with sound, and it is generally seen as the version most following ones base themselves upon. After watching most of the following ones, I think everybody just writes their scripts from the book and anything else that appears is due to like vague memories of previous iterations and nothing more, but that's beside the point. This one includes God Save the Queen for some reason. This Tiny Tim was on the older side, also very active. He also led the family in like singing a carol. This was the adaptation where I realized that in the text, future Tiny Tim is not in the grave yet. He's actively dead upstairs in the house and they have yet to bury him. So we see dead Tiny Tim, which feels wrong, but it is technically true to the source material and it will continue to pop up as we go along. It just feels incorrect to me. The Scrooge was not like a full limp or a hunch in this one. It was more like the classic old man waddle. I can vibe with the classic old man waddle. I also noted that I think the choice to make the carolers outside of Scrooge's window that really piss him off objectively terrible at singing is a really funny directorial decision, and I'm glad that that appears in many subsequent adaptations because that colors the whole moment very differently than if they happen to be talented. I wasn't particularly wowed by this version beyond being glad I wasn't in silent film territory anymore, so that's all I got on that one. Next we have the MGM one from 1938. This is in my top 10. I really like this one. It is just steeped in whimsy. It manages to add a lot, despite being only 70 minutes long. It was clearly written with the political and social climate of the Great Depression in mind, so it centers Cratchit a bit more and focuses on hope and optimism and making the best of what you've got. The Cratchit parents are played by a real married couple. Tim behaves like a child. He's not that tiny, he's like 11 or 12 I would guess, but he's very active. He gets lightly told off for playing with a ball in church, which is like a small thing, but it's also really narratively important in my opinion because it gives us more of this kid being a child. He did have a moment where he says very sadly like, oh, I'm not that good at running, which felt maybe a little deliberately pitiful, but Fred's response to that is to just pick him up and then they go off running together. It was very sweet and embraced the sort of like community care style situation where nobody has enough but they all support each other that's really emphasized throughout this movie. The spirits are a little bit more heavy-handed in making sure that Scrooge understands the lessons and what he has done wrong, but I'm not opposed to that. There's also snowball fights and sliding on ice in this one. It's a delightful time. My only critique is that they didn't end on God Blesses Everyone, as I believe every version should, because that's how the book ends and that's what it should do. But for a completely classical, true to the text retelling version of this story on film, this is tied for my favorite with the Patrick Stewart version. And if you know me, that's a big deal because I get very stressed at picking favorites, so something needs to be above all everything else for me to pick a favorite. Adaptation 7. This is the 1949 version, which was made for TV. I was impressed with the amount of original text they managed to shove into this. It's only 25 minutes long. Vibe-wise, felt like truncated 1938. This is the first version with a cure narrative. Scrooge tells Tim that they have an appointment with his friend who's a famous surgeon the following day, and this Tim is very teeny tiny. I would estimate he's probably like 5 or 6. No other notes on this one. He was really cute. I liked the framing of the narrator sitting on the couch and like easing you into the story. I think narration is really helpful in preserving the original tone, and particularly when you're trying to truncate it, that works really well because you have to jump from thing to thing and it doesn't work as fluidly as if you did the whole story. Number 8 is the Alastair Sim one from 1951. His Scrooge is very different from the others. I like this sort of like Eeyore feel of it, for lack of a better way to describe it. He wasn't very like angry or yelly. He generally avoided eye contact and was very monotone and factual and just felt very sad and lonely, and like he was having big feelings about the world that he was trying to avoid rather than choosing to face any of them. This version is widely described by scholars as being Freudian in style. I don't disagree with that. I think that's a really great description of it. They added some things in the past to sort of like set up why he is the way that he is today, and not in a like you've been abused and hurt people kind of way, which I take issue with, and we'll talk more about that when we get to one of those versions later. But in more of like a, yeah, this wasn't like a great time for him, and I see how he adapted to be the person that he is, even though that person is kind of the worst. This one also feels a little bit more overtly religious. There's a line about like seeking Jesus in his heart. Also, Tim is a lot more on the lines of magical, holy, saintly child, where like he somehow just knows the turkey is from a changed Scrooge. The line about Tiny Tim living also included a "and got well again" piece of it as well. And the runtime of this one's only 90 minutes. Most of these are like 90 minutes, 2 hours, even less. It's really great, unless you're watching 32 of them, in which case it doesn't really matter. This is the one where I cried about how many Christmas carols I had ahead of me because it made me existential, which I think is part of the Freudian. But overall, I think the things they added to the story to humanize Scrooge without excusing his behavior were really strong. This is also the closest to an autistic reading of Scrooge of any of the versions, and I thought it was done really well. So big fan of this one. The 1962 opera is adaptation number 9. I believe this is the first, but not the only Christmas Carol opera. I wasn't able to glean a lot of information on Tiny Tim specifically based on the limited clips available, so I don't have much to say here. What I did see felt pretty standard. It didn't feel like it was really any different from any of the other musicalized versions of the story, which is like over half of them. This is not counted in the 32 that I watched because I didn't see a full production. I'm just keeping the numbers involved for organization's sake, and so you know that we're closer to the end. 1962 also brought us adaptation 10, which is Mr. Magoo's. Also a hands down favorite adaptation. This one's under an hour, so if you have a short attention span, might recommend this one to my top choice. It's a musical by Bob Merrill and Joel Stein, who are responsible for Funny Girl and Gypsy, so it had this lovely like old Broadway feel to it that just expanded this Christmas nostalgia in the very best way. It's also framed as if Mr. Magoo is putting on the show A Christmas Carol in a Broadway theater. I believe it's modeled after the Belasco, so there's an audience on screen watching along with you sometimes. They like applause for the commercial breaks. It's fantastic. The vibes are great. Tiny Tim was practically a baby in this version, which I thought was great. The only critique is that they swapped Ghost, so it started in the present and then did the past second, and that was strange. I didn't like that. Other than that though, huge fan of this, top 10 for sure. For the 11, we have the 1970 Scrooge starring Albert Finney. Scrooge gets a song that I believe is called I Hate People or something along those lines. It was incredible. I adored it. I feel like the Jim Carrey Grinch took a lot of inspiration and structuring from this film, honestly. This version has people actively celebrating Scrooge's death, which is super real of them. They didn't end a God blesses everyone. That was weird. Didn't like that. And when Scrooge changes, he goes into the toy shop and buys up most of the toys and a Santa costume and brings them over to the Cratchits, where he says they're going to find the right doctors to get Tiny Tim well. This Tim is seriously ill. He's also a very tiny child who spends the beginning of this film staring in the windows of the toy shop with his sister, dreaming about what ones they would get one day if they were rich. Again, these are like small little pieces of the character to add to him, but they add a lot because they give you a glimmer of him being a regular kid beyond what he represents. My favorite part of this movie is Scrooge telling one of the ghosts, "You don't look like a ghost," and she just goes, "Thank you." Also, Scrooge falls into his grave all the way down to hell in the future and gets told by Marley that he is to be Lucifer's personal clerk, which was a fascinating choice that did happen. Number 12, Marcel Marceau, the famous mime. He had a version of the story in 1973. Again, not much archival stuff available here, but he did seem to have some sort of like narrator while he did all the acting out of the story. I'm a physical theater commedia mime mask kind of person, so I was really looking forward to whatever the extant clips were going to be of this production. I honestly felt like what I did see was so focused on like the minutiae of different pieces rather than what like the more wider, expansive, physicalized storytelling thing could look like, so I was personally a little bit disappointed by this, but I only saw about 8 minutes of it, so I can't really judge the entire piece, nor did I see Tiny Tim, so I can't give you any opinions on that. 13, this is the version performed at the Guthrie in Minneapolis. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first regional production of A Christmas Carol in the United States for 1975, and and then it expanded across all the other ones for all the other regional theaters. Most regional theaters create their own adaptations of it. They don't borrow each other's. I'm not entirely sure if the script that I got my hands on is the original that's used in 1975, but it's written by the same person who initially adapted it, so I'm assuming that it is. This version of narrator throughout, which again, love. The break in acts for intermission is after Christmas past, which seems to generally be standard, but I've also seen versions that break after Christmas present. This adaptation is fairly standard. Again, the source material is pretty dialogue heavy, so it's not very difficult to adapt to film or stage because you don't have to make all that many concrete changes, but I did like the addition of adding some lines for Martha, one of the Cratchit kids, about how difficult her job is and the terrible working conditions, which felt very in line with Dickens' original intent. 14 is Mickey's Christmas Carol, a bop, a vibe, a good time. 26-minute runtime, so it had a lot to cram in there. I felt like they were a little heavy-handed with Scrooge McDuck. I know it's for children, but still, they kind of turned him into this like, I take joy in screwing people over and being a bad person kind of character, when I personally prefer my Scrooges a little bit more tunnel focused on the goal of greed, so they don't notice the carnage they're causing or they don't care, rather than somebody who's going out of their way to kick puppies. They added Scrooge going into hell in the future thing again, which is maybe a lot for children. The casting for this, phenomenal. Goofy as Marley was perfect. Minnie and Mickey as the Cratchits, fantastic work all around. This one also gets the award for the cutest Tiny Tim. He appeared, I cried. I'll put a picture of him on screen right now. He is the littlest Mickey ever, and I feel incredibly parental towards him. They chose to have one of his feet turned in a little bit, which I really liked. Also, the exchange between Scrooge and the ghost, where Scrooge went, "What's wrong with that kind lad?" And the ghost went, "Much, I'm afraid." Was maybe not as tactful as that could have been, but it was deeply funny. So I felt fine about this version. 15 is Patrick Stewart's one-man production of the show because he started performing it in 1988, even though the filmed version of it on Broadway at the New York Public Library Special Archives is from 2001. Reminder to support your local libraries. All of the productions that I'm doing, I'm going to put the year that they were created, not necessarily the year that I watched an archival version of it in this timeline. Stewart adapted this version himself. It's pretty much word for word to the source material. I was genuinely shocked scrolling through the text the entire time at how precise this was, and also realizing that the entire word for word novella with dramatic pauses and performance thrown in still runs under 2 hours. He was not speeding through this or cutting stuff. It was truly impressive. The staging was just him in a simple suit and like 3 chairs and 2 tables, and you could just tell like how much he loved this story. I think the simplicity of it really let the text speak for itself, which highlighted a lot of things that I missed in the book the first time around, and it was truly delightful. He didn't do like major physicality shifts for any of the characters, so there's no like limp or anything for Tim, but I didn't mind that because the focus was more on just like Tim being a little kid who happened to be sick, rather than him being sort of visually, oh, that's the one with the crutch, if that makes any sense, which I really liked. And even this adaptation included God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. Of course, most of my notes in this one are just different things I forgot were in the text and I had to quickly look up, but I was constantly just struck by how much humor and whimsy is in this text itself that rarely reads in adaptations, but somebody with such a firm knowledge of the text, much like how like Shakespeare works as well, can know how to pull these little bits out and use them to make it not feel as dark as the story often comes across. Much of the moments of fun and silliness and whimsy are in fact cut from most adaptations because that information and description is superfluous and can be told visually, but I think that takes something away from the material, and I like it being added back in. This is definitely one of my favorites, if not my favorite. I'm very sad that his version was not filmed professionally for general viewing because this would be my hands down recommendation out of all of these. It felt very strongly like I was watching a mix between like Charles Dickens and then like my grandfather telling a story to a group of children seated in PJs with rapt attention. So 13 out of 10, all hail Patrick Stewart. I do believe this is the same one that is audio recorded that's on the internet. I didn't listen to that one, but I can assume it's about the same runtime, so it probably is. So at least there is that if you want to look into that. I just really love getting to watch him be delighted by the story when he told it, but I'm sure that much of that magic is captured in his voice in the recorded version as well. Now we move on to my least favorite adaptation, which is the 1988 Scrooged. This is one of those versions that tries to do a story within a story, so there is a character who is a Scrooge in relation to a production or a version of A Christmas Carol, so they either learn the lesson from the ghosts in that story, or they have their own separate ghosts on top of the production of A Christmas Carol. And you can already tell by me trying to explain this that it's not super successful narratively, because A Christmas Carol in and of itself is sort of a story within a story, so then you have like 4 different framing devices happening at once, and reality and fiction get very blurred and confusing, which leaves you with this deeply, deeply muddled work. And also this one is from the 1980s, which always requires some element of feeling like nothing makes sense and you're on drugs on top of whatever is happening in the script, which did not help this particular iteration. It was very unclear what was reality and what was ghost and what the main character was hallucinating. On top of that, the story itself wasn't very strong. The one thing that this does have going for it, in my opinion, is that as far as I can tell, this is the first one thus far to include any people of color. The Cratchit character Grace is black in this version. That being said, the Tiny Tim situation was questionable. His name is Calvin. He's non-speaking after he saw his father killed 5 years ago. I don't don't feel like I'm particularly qualified to comment on racial tropes and stereotype because that is not my academic expertise and I'm a white person, but the choice to make her and her family black and then change the storyline so that she's a single mother and her son is traumatized from seeing his father killed rather than just being physically ill felt pointed to me in a way that maybe I didn't like. In Christmas Future, we see Calvin institutionalized, and in that image he is dressed in the exact same way they dress young Tommy in the original production of The Who's Tommy, which is like white shorts, white knee socks, white t-shirt, open jacket. I'll put an image of it on screen, of Tommy, not of the movie. I don't have that, but this became a sort of like iconic image related to that show. That show and original concept album from the 60s being about a kid who becomes catatonic after seeing his father murder his mother's lover, which felt very deliberate narratively. But then I remembered that Tommy the Musical was in 1993 and this movie's from 1988, and I can't as of right now find any references to that aesthetic existing in relation to Tommy beforehand. Like, it's not in the 1975 movie or related to the original album. So now I'm wondering if that visual aesthetic was previously related to something before it was made famous by Tommy, and I haven't found it because I've only found the Tommy versions of it. Like, perhaps this was a visual image associated with mental institutions or like children's schools, particularly like children's mental institutions before this time. I have not been able to find any information on this, but this is my biggest conundrum to come out of this entire project. So if you know anything about it, please let me know. I will be forever grateful. I also just love how Tommy manages to magically come up in every single one of these analyses. I feel like it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. All of that being said, I think this linkage to Tommy, not just in potentially accidental visual aesthetic, but also in the idea of him being unable to speak following trauma, begins to place him in this view of being inherently a little godlike or special and singular in some way because society is fairly used to seeing his narrative treated like that, which is not dissimilar from the wholly innocent saint situation of the traditional Tiny Tim. And arguably this is even worse because at the end he says, "God bless us everyone," as his first words. Also, the Ghost of Christmas Present says that to speak is his choice, only he can break the spell, which adds this magical quality to it that is strange and weird, and I do not like it. So overall, not a win with this one. Do not recommend, but it's okay because Adaptation 17 is of course The Muppet Christmas Carol. This one made me cry of joy. I was so excited to watch this one. I have never seen it before. It's fantastic. The casting is fantastic. Michael Caine committed to the bit and I respect it. Incredible work. I did want to see a world where Michael Caine as Scrooge was literally the only human and everybody else was a Muppet. That's what I was told to expect, and that was incorrect. There are lots of townspeople. We could have gotten rid of those people. I was also initially mad at the Marleys being plural, but then I realized that Statler and Waldorf are the Marleys, which is delightful and a fantastic choice. Good work, everybody. I also enjoyed them making Miss Piggy a canonically terrible mother. The framing of having Dickens involved as narrator and also for shenanigans purposes was perfect. I didn't love this Tiny Tim, I'm not gonna lie. They didn't include the cripple line, which I appreciated, but he did decide to sing them a song with no provocation, and he spoke like no child has ever spoken in their entire life. It was giving Old Soul in a way that I didn't entirely love. It almost felt like it leaned into all the stereotypical problems with Tiny Tim, so unfortunately I'm gonna dock some points for that. According to the academics and the historians, film adaptations were sort of based on and modeled around the 1935 version until this 1992 Muppets version, when adaptations then switched to be modeled after this one. Again, I didn't personally notice that. They're all really similar, but that's what the literature claims, so it's worth mentioning. Adaptation 18 is the 1992 ballet at Northern Ballet Theatre. I was interested in this one because the idea of adding more dance in there might have implications for Tiny Tim, but they went the crutchy route and decided to not have him dance at all. He played the recorder to accompany the family dancing. He led some of the carols when people dance while holding him. There's a very brief moment he tries to join in with his crutch, but it's very, very brief. He was mostly just kind of carried everywhere. Honestly, a bit of a letdown. It was so similar to all the other versions. I was kind of hoping something different would happen here. The only spoken lines in the show were the ghost of Marley giving a speech to Scrooge, which felt unbelievably out of place. Like, the concept of what he's trying to explain is sort of hard to get across via dance or tangentially related Christmas hymn he might dance to, so I get it, but it felt distinctly strange. Also, Scrooge straight up slapped Cratchit to show that he is mean, which I get because we're stuck with this visual storytelling, but there's a fine line between Scrooge being somebody who feels somewhat redeemable and somebody who is an active abuser, and I didn't love where this one settled on that particular line. Favorite part of this one is they pulled a lot of professionally trained boy choir kids, which to me feels like home, and specifically so around Christmas season. A Ceremony Carols is my go-to Christmas listen if you're a nerd like I am. So that to me felt like something that was missing for a lot of other versions of the story because they tend to lean more into this theatrical style of singing and then they do the choral style of singing. I might be alone in that preference, but I was really happy to see that appear here. It doesn't really appear in any of the other ones if I remember correctly. Next we have the 1994 Flintstones Christmas Carol. Again, this one tried to do a story within a story thing. It doesn't work. It also did a lot of the sexism is funny humor, which I'm never really a fan of. Even though Wilma was like a kick-butt stage manager, she did save the day, there were still pieces of it that didn't sit right with me. The cripple line was kept. This Tiny Tim's also carried everywhere, but there was a piece where he was playing with a family dog, sorry, dinosaur, and that made him very kid-like. Liked that, was a fan of that. They also made a lot of rock puns because it's the Flintstones. There was like Crackit and Marbly. But overall, I can't recommend this one. It felt muddled and confused, not something I would show children anytime soon. Our next one either is my favorite or it was super different from all of the others while still respecting the source material, and I love musical theater, so I was going to inherently find this fun and magical regardless of quality, which is what happened when I saw Great Gatsby 14 times and I said that the musical is a fantastic adaptation, and that was not factually all that true. But I do genuinely think that the Alan Menken Lynn Ahrens musical production at Madison Square Garden is probably the most whimsical and magical of the bunch. This production ran from 1994 to 2003. It was filmed for the Special Archives in 2000. I can't tell if the script changed at any point in that whole process. It changed a little bit for the movie, so I'm inclined to believe that it did a little bit from version to version. Again, we'll get to the film adaptation when we get there, don't worry. I would like to formally petition that we bring this tradition back to the theater at Madison Square Garden. Cirque du Soleil is using it this season, Annie had it last season, but if we could bring this Christmas Carol back next year, I would love that. I would pay money for that. The lobby was like built to look like a little British village. They had carolers and people rollerblading and dancing in costume, and the set had like a whole village that extended all the way up the audience on both sides and was used all the way up there. People like popped out of windows and such. This theater is about the same size as Radio City, like in capacity, if that is helpful for your brain. You can Google it. There's pictures of the Madison Square Garden Theater on the Googles. The aisles of the audiences were used. At the end, Scrooge went into the audience and was just like throwing money at people. It's just over 90 minutes straight through. The music is fantastic. The dancing, choreographed by Susan Stroman, was unreal. There were some pieces of it that were like pretty much just watching the Rockettes. The cast was Met Opera levels of huge. At one point, an entire children's choir with like 30 kids just spawned near the end of the show. Where did they come from? The score also included lots of different voice types and styles and timbres we don't see in theater very much anymore, which is really lovely. Good vibes all around. I teared up on multiple occasions sitting by myself in the very cold archives because of how absolutely delighted that I was by this version. They also always stunt cast Scrooge. One year he was played by Roger Daltrey of The Who. What I wouldn't give to see that. That year Scrooge was also understudied by Patrick Page, funnily enough. The year that was filmed for the archives is the year that young Nick Jonas played young Scrooge, but was not the kid in the archival recording, if I remember correctly, which I think is really funny because like they wouldn't have known what he would become later. A very teeny tiny Andrew Keenan Bolger and a very teeny tiny Jesse McCartney would also play young Scrooge in various years. My other favorite thing about this production is how perfect of a time capsule it is for colorblind casting, because some of the choices made little to no genetic sense, but I loved it anyway. It was fantastic. They also had a Black Ghost of Christmas Present, which is consistent across the years of production. The first time I would see this trend anywhere else start was in the 1997 Tim Curry Christmas Carol with Whoopi Goldberg. I don't know if that followed this casting as inspiration or if it is unrelated, but from here on, the Ghost of Christmas Present is more likely to be black than not, which just feels notable. Like, it doesn't feel notable if diversity were just a thing people were starting to map into this story, but it is notable because none of the other ghosts or Marleys or Scrooges in further versions are ever played by people of color. If I remember correctly, it's just the middle ghost that they begin to cast that way, which I do think is very interesting. This Scrooge is not scary or menacing at all. He felt more just like, this is how things are and everybody needs to get over it, bootstraps territory, which is my preferred option. I think this version took some inspiration from the 1951 version because it was a little more religion and God-ish, and the Scrooge characterization is very similar. They also added some similar things like adding to his childhood based on Dickens' own childhood with the father getting sent to debtor's prison. We also see Scrooge and Marley working together to screw people over, which I'm not opposed to. I feel like the things added were fairly in line with and nodding toward the source material rather than huge departures from it. I generally find the adaptations that take a big swing at changing things tend to be poorly received, with the exception of the few that do it very carefully, like this one in the Muppets, for example. They also, in the scenes where Marley shows him all of the other ghosts who are miserable in the afterlife or purgatory, depending on how you want to interpret this, they're all wearing the masks connected with the miser characters in the world of Commedia dell'arte, primarily Pantalone and Dottore, and some of them were also dragging their zani, which is like their servants, with them as well. I saw a couple Pulcinelle, which I thought was really interesting. I know that this is like, that's a niche thing, but for me personally, it added a lot to the scene because that is such like strong visual shorthand for who those people were in their lives, and my nerd heart was freaking out because why would you just randomly include that in a children's show? Fantastic directorial choice there. Tim had 2 leg braces. He also sang a song about how lucky they are to have each other, which maybe wasn't my favorite, but this idea of God bless us everyone is echoed in a musical theme throughout the show, so that at least feels a little less out of place when Tim says it, which I really liked. But overall, it felt a little more like, due to the songs, he was locked into this inspirational kind of character than we see in other versions, which wasn't my favorite. And the other huge disability issue is they created a character of the blind beggar who is styled to look a lot like the beggar woman Catherine in Sweeney Todd, which is musical theater, that was on purpose. She follows in this trope of like weird disabled lady who actually turns out to be kind of witchy and is able to see things other people can't. She ends up transforming into this beautiful ballerina as the ghost of the future, an oracle disguised as a disabled person. I'm not a fan of that. We don't need that. So low score on the disability front, but I had a great time and that counts for something. We should bring this one back specifically so that I can go. Adaptation 21 is the 1997 Tim Curry animated version. This Scrooge has a dog that follows him everywhere who's merely just a little guy. Jodie Benson plays Belle. That's fun. They added the piece back in about Scrooge loving books as a child, specifically the adventures of Robinson Crusoe, and then later we see Tiny Tim, who also loves Robinson Crusoe, and they bond over it, which gives him character traits and expands the mirroring between these two characters that I really wish was there in everything else. Massive fan of that choice. It should be stolen and used in everything else going forward. They also added an extra comment during the present when they repeat to him his statement about decreasing the surplus population, where Ghost Whoopi Goldberg says something along the lines of, "You should remember who the surplus is. Nobody is worthless or unfit to live," which is perhaps a little heavy-handed, but also feels somewhat necessary given the modern implications of what this line now means. That being said, the source material already has a line there that says, "Forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that, in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child," which they could have just done a slightly simplified version of there. I think it would have felt a little bit less heavy-handed and would have been closer to the text, but that's just a nitpick. They also chose to not use the word cripple, which is fantastic. They instead say that he is sick, and in the church situation, it might be nice for them to be thankful for their health and good fortune, which is still a little inspiration porny, but it's a lot better than the original version at least. But they do tell him that he's going to get well at the end, so you know what, there's that. I wasn't enchanted by this version. It's categorically fine. I think I was starting to lose interest around this point. Next we have the 1999 Patrick Stewart movie. This is his one-man show, but then they put other people in it. It also includes Joel Grey and a very young Higgins from Ted Lasso. The only changes that I noted that fell out of left field is they changed Fan's name to Fran for some reason. I don't know why they did that. It honestly could have been an accident. Whatever. If we're going for text purity and adaptation, this has to be my favorite. And I also have little to no notes on this one because it's just the text performed live on screen, and I really appreciated that. Patrick Stewart is my favorite. Thank you, sir, for your service. Adaptation 23 is the 2004 film adaptation of the Madison Square Garden musical. I don't think this adapted well to film at all. There were lots of things on stage that feel grand and festive and magical once you are seeing them live, but then you place them in the real world and they feel flat and uninteresting, which highlights a lot of the flaws that the script itself kind of has. This Scrooge was deeply bent over. He used a cane. He felt a lot grumpier. They changed the Tiny Tim situation a little bit, so the dad sang most of the song about being grateful, and then Tim joined in, which felt a lot more age appropriate. I really liked that change. I should also note that Tiny Tim in this version is played by a teeny tiny Jacob Collier, a person who is so delighted by life and the world and existence that any complaints about this being a stereotype in this character go away for the specific iteration because that's just who he is as a person. Yeah, they also gave him more airtime. We see him dream of being able to walk up the stairs by himself next Christmas and being able to do things on his own without help, which is age appropriate. Also feels a little, oh, I wish I weren't disabled, and that's kind of complicated. I just, again, was generally unenchanted by this version. The costuming and the design choices were baffling at best, and that did not help. I think the musical on stage is far superior, so again, can we bring it back next season? 2006, we have Sesame Street Christmas Carol. As far as I'm concerned, this is not a Christmas Carol. That's fine. It's great for what it is. It's just more inspired by it than anything. Oscar the Grouch is delivered ghostograms rather than being visited by spooky ghosts, which makes sense. I thought that was really sweet and really smart. It's overall less about teaching Oscar to be a good Grouch and more about teaching us about Christmas. So they go into the past and they see old Christmas stories, like a version of The Gift of the Magi that's shown to be the lives of Bert and Ernie, which I must say was the gayest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, just the absolute gayest thing I've ever seen. And then the Ghost of Christmas Present was Kristen Chenoweth. She taught us about Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. That was cool. And then in the future, we imagine what Robot Christmas might look like. How fun! Adaptation 26 is the Barbie in A Christmas Carol from 2008. This one, again, uses a framing device, but it's more that it's like Barbie telling Shelley the story than it is a story within a story, so it really worked. I appreciated that. This Scrooge is a girl. Her name is Eden. She's a famous opera singer, and she's not allowed to experience fun or joy or downtime as a child because she's forced by her aunt to learn to be selfish and to practice all the time, which makes her a bad friend, and over the course of the Ghost, she learns how to be a better friend. Again, I'm generally not the hugest fan of the abuse people idea because many abused people also break those cycles and choose not to hurt people and can feel a lot of anxiety about, will I be able to? Am I doomed to repeat the past? Whatever. But Eden is fairly young in this story. She learns to break those cycles pretty easily in real time. I thought this worked fairly well. Also, she and her best friend Catherine also felt very, very, very gay, but that's beside the point. Tiny Tim is a little orphan girl named Tammy. She uses a crutch, and Catherine wants to one day adopt her, gay, and she volunteers at the orphanage to help put together a concert that ultimately Eden ends up coming to and paying to fund the entire orphanage so the orphans don't get thrown into the street. Otherwise, she felt pretty standard for a Tiny Tim, but she had extra pieces to where they made her feel like a kid, particularly that she's like interested in music and like is engaging with other children. That's so fun. Docking points on this one because Eden's cat freaks me out. Adaptation 26. I'm so tired. This is my other least favorite. This is the 2009 Disney Christmas Carol, which I remember being terrifying from when I was tiny, and it still continues to be terrifying. I don't know that we needed a chase scene in the story. I don't know that we needed a lot of jump scares or a little body horror. I don't love how Scrooge is physically violent with Belle. I think the animation style is creepy and uncanny to the level of the Polar Express. Also, the ignorance and want that come out of the cloak of the ghost of Christmas present grow up and become a murderer locked in a prison and a mad person who tries to hump Scrooge and then is put into a straitjacket. I don't know why that was there. I don't think that it needed to be there. This is for children. Tiny Tim gets well at the end of it. I have nothing positive to say about this movie. Scrooge and Marley 2012. This is one of the worst movies I've ever seen, but I highly recommend watching it with a group of queer friends piled onto a too small couch with a table full of snacks at like 11 p.m. That's not how I watched it. I watched it at 2 in the afternoon, but I imagine that would make this one a really fun time. I think there does need to be a version where Scrooge and Marley are canonically gay for each other. The word partner is used entirely too much in this text, and Scrooge lives where Marley formerly did, and that just feels poignant to me. Like, what if having him be extra horrible in the last 7 years is because of his grief? There's like a lot we could play narratively with here. So I found this gay adaptation of the story. I was hoping that maybe that was what I would find. Instead, I found a truly baffling modern adaptation where Ben is a grumpy accountant who works for a gay piano bar called Screws. He met a guy named Jacob at either YMCA or a shelter, unclear, after his father kicks him out of the house for being gay on Christmas, and Jacob and Ben work at Fezziwigs, another gay bar, and then they steal it out from underneath Fezziwig because Jacob is kind of the worst. Also, Ben is dating a guy named Bill who eventually leaves him and then also dies, and it only says he got very sick, which, like, AIDS was right there. Scrooge could be a grumpy old gay man who hates Christmas because he grew up in the 80s and all of his friends died of AIDS and he feels alone and he's afraid to love again. What a great story that could have been. And also, what do you mean Jacob and Ben were just friends? You made a gay Christmas Carol and you didn't pair up the people who are partners for presumably decades. Also, Tim is probably like 15 years old. He had a vague unknown illness that makes him cough a lot and be bad at breathing. It reads like asthma, but then they act like it's brand new to them, which isn't super typical at that age and that severity. It was really weirdly done. But he goes to a specialist at the end of the story and presumably gets better. Great. Also, Scrooge gets a husband at the end of the movie, and him being called a fastidious old queen like it's a slur is still the funniest part of this movie. But overall, missed opportunities all around, very disappointed, but at least it was something new and different from everything else, and that is not nothing. Speaking of new and different, next adaptation is our 28th, and this is the version that is written by Jack Thorne, the guy who wrote Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. This is at the Old Vic and on Broadway at the same time. It started at the Old Vic in 2017. It repeated every season there and then appeared on Broadway in 2019 concurrently. It was supposed to reappear for the 2020 season. It was canceled due to 2020. Apparently went on tour in 2021. It is also at the Perlman Performing Arts Center right now. We will get to that. I saw it last night. I'm not a fan of this adaptation. I think it takes huge swings to add to the text in a way that undercuts the actual source material to some extent. For example, they choose to make Scrooge's father not only a debtor, like Dickens' father was, but an angry alcoholic as well, and I'm not sure why. Fezziwig is an undertaker for some reason, so Scrooge works at a funeral home, which is very funny for the current production because Michael Cerveris, who plays Scrooge, is the original dad in Fun Home, so he just continues to work at funeral homes, which is an oddly specific career to have in theater. They make Belle the daughter of Fezziwig and a very strong businesswoman, which sort of girl bossifies her in a way that maybe we didn't totally need. It also changes it so rather than having her dump him because he's obsessed with gold, he leaves to go make enough money to be worthy of her by his own standards and then never returns. Fan is the ghost of Christmas future and she speaks to him. In the future, instead of seeing himself dead and seeing people like sell his belongings and somewhat celebrate his death, he sees this funeral where his nephew and Cratchit and Belle all come to eulogize him, and Fan says a passing line about people selling his stuff off. The narrative purpose of this is to show him that people wanted to love him, he just wouldn't let them in, but I personally feel like that narrative can be expanded upon and explored differently. I feel like we're kind of telling the wrong thing and showing the wrong thing with this change, and it really should be flipped back the way that it previously is in the source material. And then also after he comes to and is a changed man, he goes to Belle's house first to sort of apologize for how things ended. I think that having him confront his ex is exceptionally weird because it's more for his closure than it is for her, so it feels inherently selfish to me, which I don't think matches with what we want to see from this character after he is changed as a person. I did really like her response to basically being like, I'm glad you realized things should have happened differently, but like I'm all right with how things happened. I'm content with the life that I have now. That theme was really cool. I wish that had been explored more and also perhaps differently. And then also after you think the show is over, they say God bless us everyone. He then goes back into like purgatory, unclear, and meets Jacob Marley again, who tells him to like earn the second chance that he's been given. And then everybody sings another Christmas Carol. that just felt strangely tacked on there, because everybody is so used to the show ending on God Bless Us Everyone, so by that point everybody is restless, and suddenly there's another 15 minutes of a show that your audience is a lot less engaged with, if that makes sense. So I just don't think that is particularly a successful addition. I also think some of the staging stuff didn't quite work. It felt very Curious Incident and how blue and sparse it was, but Curious brings you on a journey through lots of different places that focus on imagination, which like helps you build up within the constraints of the fluidity of the set that they need to have, where this just felt like it was never clear where precisely we were, or if we were in Ghostland or if we were in real life, because everything happens with the same lighting in the same place in virtually no set or props. We also see Scrooge reenact a lot of the things in the past rather than watch himself and react to it, which felt like something that I was kind of missing. And there's a lot of speaking in unison, but not necessarily on the lines or words I would highlight as ones that need emphasis, but I'm happy to admit that that could just be a me problem. I just think that chanting has a particular implication that is not acknowledged or utilized properly in the way that this is personally staged. Things that I like about this version, however, we have this defensiveness in Scrooge initially. It takes him a long time to warm up to the idea that maybe he just isn't a fantastic person. I'm a huge fan of that. It feels a lot more humanistic and real than a like sudden complete 180. There's lots of diversity in this casting. Big fan of that, though again, the only ghost of color is consistently the sassy ghost of Christmas Present, which maybe I'm overthinking it. Just like every time I saw it, I was like, the sound team, absolutely on their game with all the little sound cues of doors opening and closing and locking and all of that. Just continuously impressed by the precision of that. This is the most musical Christmas Carol on this list that isn't explicitly a musical. It is carols all the way through, a lot of it with live instruments on stage, which is my favorite of all things. They also use handbells. Handbells are not used enough in theater. I love that they're here. The show really knows how to craft a vibe. The entire theater is like covered in these little lanterns and fairy lights, and pre-show all the actors are in the audience. They're engaging with people, giving out treats. There's a group of folks on stage playing instruments. It's like just a very cozy, old-timey experience. And also after Scrooge goes to Fred, he asks if they can move the Christmas lunch to the Cratchits to share with everybody, and so they enlist the entire audience to help them gather all the ingredients, with like cloth chutes coming down from the balconies to pour down apples and oranges onto the stage. There's audience members passing forward sausages and pies and side dishes. The turkey comes in on a zip line, the Brussels sprouts come down by parachute, and some little kids are picked up from the audience to help bring in this giant gelatin dessert, which, hate to be a historian, that wasn't a thing till 1897 at the very earliest, so it doesn't really make sense. So I'm gonna let it slide for the festivities of it. Also because I don't think parachutes really existed back then either, because planes were not really a thing, right? 1840s. Anyway, this bit is absolutely magical. It's such fun. It builds this feeling of camaraderie and Christmas spirit in the audience. It is the best part of this production for me. I was really excited for it when I went to see it live. I think it does accidentally highlight how much the rest of the show does not have this level of warmth or Christmas vibiness to it, because for most Christmas Carol productions, that level of brightness and festiveness appears throughout, where here it is just in that 10 minutes or so of time, and that's all that you get. Jack Thorne did want to deliberately make sure Tiny Tim is only ever played by authentically disabled actors, which is something that has been the case for all of his productions of this version of the show. I'm a huge fan of this. The text expands Tiny Tim's character a little bit in a way that I think wanted to make it less ableist, but ended up accidentally making it more so. First of all, we see him die. That is one of the main things that actually starts to turn Scrooge toward the idea of perhaps changing as a person. I don't know that that's necessary, and also thinking about how little these little actors are, perhaps maybe not something I personally would want to have small children acting out every night. That's a personal boundary for me as a director and an educator, but that's not everybody's, that's fine. They took out all the lines about a crutch to make it more expansive for all kinds of disability. I did like that, but I don't think that necessitates them taking out the piece about seeing an empty chair and a crutch without an owner. That seems narratively great, and it also doesn't involve a small child having to experience their fake parents screaming at their limp body to stay with them every night. And also after the feast is brought, Tim and Scrooge have this whole like conversation where Tim talks like no child has ever spoken in their entire life, and the God Blesses Everyone comes out of absolutely nowhere. And they may have removed the traditional lines about a cripple, but then they added a new one in, so that just defeats its own purpose. I can tell like the goal here was to give Tiny Tim more to work with and take him out of this holy saintly creature territory, but it ends up making him more of a holy saintly creature by accident, which is an issue. I do want to note that the script was written in 2017. It was probably written before 2017 because it went on stage in 2017, and disability media studies have changed a great deal since then, but this also wouldn't totally have flown in 2017 either as great representation, so not quite the saving grace I would like to give it, but I really appreciate the effort and the desire to cast disabled actors in disabled roles in very mainstream productions of this. I think that is great, and it sets a really awesome example going forward. So that is that. We'll talk more about this production again at the end. Adaptation 29 is A Christmas Carol Goes Wrong. This is a favorite just for what it is, and what it is abject chaos. It was also shockingly close to the source material, given that the whole bit of this is just to make everything completely go wrong and the general plot doesn't really matter at all. This one also has a show within a show where the Scrooge guy learns his lesson over the course of the story, but the mischief comedy folks know how to hold lots of storylines concurrently without it being super overwhelming, so it really worked here. It's also a thing that you expect when you're going into a Mischief show, because they do usually have 2 or 3 layers of story happening concurrently. Overall, the Tiny Tim in this version obviously doesn't matter, but they do say that he will walk again at the end. The original Tiny Tim is using crutches, like he had just broken his leg, so perhaps in this version he's not sick, he just like doesn't have the money to set a broken leg properly. He is meant to sneeze at a different point, so maybe he is ill, but I'm not gonna look too deeply in this one because it really doesn't matter for the purposes of the story. I just wanted to include it because we love the Goes Wrong folks in this house, and if I was gonna watch this many Christmas carols, I should watch one for fun. Number 30, we're almost done, friends. This is the 2018 one-man Simon Callow production. It is based on Charles Dickens' own personal performance of the story. I thought it was fine. It added in lots of sound effects. It had him constantly walking between different rooms in what I think was an abandoned warehouse of some kind. Honestly, all of that felt more distracting rather than elevating of the text. It's pretty close to the source material, which makes sense, though with Tim, they say his little limbs were encased in iron frames, which is notable because it's just one iron brace in the original. I don't know if that is pulled from Dickens' version or not, because the version he went and spoke, he did edit and add to. Perhaps he intended to have Tim using 2 braces, which would then be of note. Also, the line about the blind men's dogs is in this, but it's cut in half, so it doesn't include the piece about it being better to not see than to have an evil eye. It just notes that blind men's dogs pull him into doorways to get away from Scrooge. When this line appears in other versions, like the Jack Thor one, for example, it is cropped in the same way, and that's a small change, but it does alter the disability framing a bit that I think is interesting. I do think by this point I was starting to lose it. I have very little notes on this one. Patrick Stewart's one-man version continues to reign supreme. Nothing can really compare. I also think that one-man things on screen feel tedious, where they feel like a feat of engineering when you see them live. It just doesn't really work when you're trying to adapt it to film. Next we have the 2019 miniseries that's on Hulu, but it's combined into one 3-hour episode on Hulu. Don't know that anybody asked for and or needed this one. I don't think there was a market for a grittier version of A Christmas Carol where he's a victim of CSA and then extorts Mrs. Cratchit because he knows she'll do anything for the money to save her son, and also Jacob Marley is only trying to help him because he can't leave purgatory until Scrooge is repented. Is just really what anybody wanted or needed. It was also very visually dark, so you couldn't actually see what was happening most of the time, but when you did, some of the pieces were genuinely kind of traumatizing. Scrooge himself is framed as almost like Sherlockian. He obsessively counts everything. He knows too much about numbers and calculations. He likes everything just so. He has very little understanding of the feelings of people outside of himself in a way that feels maybe a little bit offensive. Mrs. Cratchit, after being extorted, says that she is cursing him, something about summoning spirits to hold a mirror to his face. I don't know that Mary Cratchit being magical and sort of getting her revenge by forcing the universe to haunt him is the attempted girl boss thing that's helpful here. Also, to go back to the idea of hurt people, it especially rubbed me the wrong way here by adding so much more explicit abuse into Scrooge's past and then adding so much more of him repeating that same cycle himself in the past, because they sort of heavy-handed tried to include him using that as an excuse and then them being like, no, that's not an excuse, which felt very pandery to an audience. Like, they're like, well, we know this narrative is wrong, so we're being explicit about it, which just means that you're not telling your story well enough, in my opinion. I also don't think that we need any more this person is hurt and that's why they hurt people and now we need to have that pointed out to them kinds of stories, because a lot of people, again, who've been abused are terrified of continuing these cycles, and media tends to assume that you're going to carry the legacy with you. So I personally prefer versions of the story, especially because he is typically unequivocally forgiven at the end, where Scrooge is more evil in the sense of just not thinking beyond himself and beyond his job, versus versions where he's actively choosing to go out into the world and create evil, because learning to see beyond yourself or breaking out of some sort of like isolating depression or grief spiral is something that can start to really change in a short moment where you just really turn things around, whereas the other thing feels less able to change and has a wider circle of harm to it, which I guess brings in some questions, right, as to what degree somebody is no longer redeemable and should be forgiven, which is a line that's different for different people. But again, that feels out of line for A Christmas Carol. I feel like these screenwriters would have been able to create something much more compelling and interesting had they just created something completely new. It felt like they were locked into A Christmas Carol and were regretting it the entire time, and I was regretting it too. This, however, might have been my favorite Tiny Tim. He doesn't muse about when he's going to get better. He knows he's congenitally disabled, and that's not possible. Also, this performance was incredible. The actor's name is Lenny Rush, and he has a form of dwarfism. Go find him. He's fantastic. He just wants to be strong enough to use his sister's ice skates one day, and in the future version, he dies because he did the very age-appropriate thing of stealing her sister's ice skates and running off to the pond where he drowns because the ice breaks and he can't swim. They made Fan the Ghost of Christmas Present, which was odd, but you had this very, like, swashbuckly adventurous academic vibe to her that I can only dream of possessing. She was incredibly cool. I've seen a few versions try to use like personal ghosts as the ghosts, and I think that muddles everything a lot further. It never quite dramaturgically works, but she was cool enough that I will forgive it in this one particular time, and also I want her coat. I also kind of liked that Scrooge was defensive for most of this. Like he's trying to see things as excuses or explanations for behavior rather than acting like an adult and acknowledging how it shaped him and how he can choose to not be shaped by this any longer, because in order to actually change, he has to work through a lot of the cognitive dissonance. And I think it's cool that we see this tear at him a bit here. It didn't quite land the plane at the end where he says he's not going to repent or change because he believes he deserves the fate he was shown in the future. The only thing he wants changed is to spare the fate of Tiny Tim, and that's what saves him, because that's technically him repenting. It's interesting. It doesn't give us the full like breadth of growth that it could have, but again, the added nuance of I don't expect forgiveness or want it, I'm just going to focus on the future, and acknowledging that some wrongs done in the past cannot be righted is really interesting and really strong, and I think if added more consciously and thoughtfully would make the general Christmas Carol story work a lot better for like a modern audience who knows things about brains, because it is a bit initially simplistic in its belief that this character can change that much and that quickly and fix everything. I think the idea of some harms being unfixable is something that can be played with and is not yet really explored by adaptation, so I was interested by that being brought up. Number 32 is the Christmas carols I grew up with at Trinity Rep in Rhode Island. I have not had a chance to go back to Rhode Island to see this year's. I don't know what it looks like. I honestly don't know if I'm going to, unfortunately, but they change it up every year, and for the last 5 years or so they've made a concerted effort to cast disabled kids in the role of Tiny Tim. I also want to note that Trinity and all their educational programs are fantastic around disability more generally. I am not the only one in my field who began their career there. That is not a fluke. I'm not saying this just to like advertise them. I'm saying it because I mean it very genuinely. They did a version in 2023 that had Tiny Tim as canonically neurodivergent, developmentally disabled, so he was less like the quiet, perfect angel child and more the lightly chaotic, hard to track down child who's always at risk of doing something that puts their life in danger. It was never made quite dramaturgically clear why he died, but Cratchit said something along the lines of "I should have protected you," which to me insinuated that like he ran off and something bad happened, like he drowned or got run over by a carriage or something along those lines. This was also the first time that I ever saw a version that sort of retrofit the text to mostly dramaturgically fit a different interpretation of disability, which I think is fascinating and has not been played with nearly enough, or really at all in any of the versions that I've seen, though the major mainstream conversation of authentic casting is only about a decade old, so I expect to see that in Christmas carols going forward. It does make you wonder what kind of disabilities combined with different time periods, since many regional versions also change settings entirely, which weirdly the films like never did. I was kind of bummed by that. They were all like, it's 1843 the entire time. But that opens up a lot of new possibilities for something interesting and exciting that I haven't really seen really utilized yet. Trinity will also often have a child as the ghost of Christmas Future, which I always find fascinating when they do that. I haven't seen that idea appear anywhere else. I assumed that I was going to, and I didn't, so that's just of note. Adaptation 33 is the one-man production performed by Jefferson Mays and directed by Michael Arden, which was filmed in 2020 at the United Palace. They also did a stint at the Nederlander Theater in 2022 on Broadway. This one seems to be adapted more closely to how the Simon Callow adaptation is, not the Patrick Stewart one. Again, I don't think one-man stuff really works on film. They clearly adapted it deliberately for film here, but if I can imagine what this probably looked like on stage, I feel like it was a little bit too busy. They added projections and sounds of other people that overall made it feel more bare and empty than if they just had one dude on the stage doing the whole thing himself. Nothing of note for Tiny Tim here, much like Stewart's, there was no like physicality shift or anything like that, so not much of notes on that one. 34 is the Star Kid VHS Christmas Carol Live from 2022. There's Tiny Tim has a cough. That's all that I wrote down. This is sort of like EDM-esque version based in the 80s. It's a really strong adaptation. It's a really fun adaptation, but it felt so non-Christmassy I can't say that I liked it. I need Christmas festivities in my Christmas Carol to enjoy it. It's a thing that I learned from this adaptation. 35 is the 2022 film Spirited. This is loosely based on A Christmas Carol. The general idea of it is that the ghosts pick one guy a year to haunt, and this year there's a guy played by Ryan Reynolds who is said to be unredeemable, and one of the lead ghosts, played by Will Ferrell, decides he's going to try anyway. It's a really fun time. The score is composed by Pasek and Paul, so it's very bop heavy. There's no Tiny Tim character in this one, so it doesn't really matter in a disability sense, but I had a great time, and I do recommend it for fun purposes. And then our last and final Christmas Carol is, of course, the production currently playing at the Perlman Performing Arts Center downtown, where I bought my ticket for the first preview just based on there's going to be a Christmas Carol that's live around here, and I didn't look into any information about it, and I walked in and I saw the lanterns hanging from the ceiling and I went, oh, it's the Jack Thorne one. I did like it better seeing it live. I will say that I think it works better in the round than in the retrofit for the proscenium that they had in the archival production. They also gave me a gingerbread cookie that I haven't eaten yet. That's my snack when I'm done with this video. But that was really fun. They were giving out cookies and clementines, which felt very festive. The crafting of vibe is just immaculate. It was so cool to sit inside of this, especially anytime I see something in the archive and then I get to see it live, it feels more like electric because I'm like, I get to see it live. It exists. Oh my goodness. I also thought that Izzy as Tiny Tim was phenomenal. phenomenal. The rest of the performances were phenomenal as well, and also like being involved in the bringing of the feast was a lot of fun. I think that had I not known what I was going to expect, I would have been very overwhelmed by how jump scary it is, but I knew what all the jump scares were, so it was okay. But that was just like an access thing to note. I did not do an accessibility review of this because I was note taking for this. But yeah, if you have any questions about accessibility for the show, let me know, and I'm happy to answer your questions. I do remember it, I just didn't make it an explicit one. Anyway, even live, it still felt emotionally detached, for lack of a better way to phrase it. Everything takes place in this like slightly dim blue lighting in the center of the staging in the round, and everything has the same level and kind of emotion to it that made me miss a lot of like brightness and hominess and whimsy that this story really needs to be successful, at least in my book, because it's easy for the story to be like bogged down by the weightiness of it. You need to pull out the bright spots to make it feel Christmassy rather than just being an existential tale about forgiveness, and this version really just didn't do that super successfully. To quote a really lovely family sitting behind me, the Cratchits look like they were in prison, and that's so real. Turns out I actually wrote down what they said. It was that the Cratchits feel like specifically they're in a space prison, which I think gives better imagery than just being in a prison, so I wanted to include that. I think it made it hard for an audience to lock in. It was a much more restless audience than I've seen at other things recently, even the more like tourist heavy shows, and less locked in than I've also seen at other Christmas carols. So it doesn't seem like it was just people like knew what to expect, so they're less engaged in the story. Again, I also got talking to folks around me and eavesdropping on other people's opinions, because I try not to talk about theater criticism and theater. I did break that a little bit to talk to people, but anyway, it seemed like this feeling is generally consensus of the folks around me, which makes sense given what we know about all the other adaptations, right? People don't really like when you make big changes from the source material, especially that cuts down on the Christmas spirit. That's just not a thing that people tend to be into when they're checking out a Christmas Carol. The one thing I did love about seeing it live that did not resonate at all when I saw it in the archival version is that right after Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning, initially one voice and then added one by one, they sing "See Amid the Winter Snow" in a full belt, which has this like mythical war cry energy that just gives me chills. It's just so strong. So I'm glad that I saw it. I did have a good time. I just dramaturgically don't think this version totally works. But if you've seen it, let me know your thoughts on it, because obviously I come at it from a very hyper-specific angle. That was my 32nd Christmas Carol in a row. But that is all of them that I watched. Anyway, my top recommendations, just to put them on one spot in no particular order, is Mr. Magoo's The Muppets, the 1938 MGM version, the 1951 Alastair Sim version, Goes Wrong and Spirited just for the shenanigans of them, and then my personal favorites are the archival Patrick Stewart and the Macon musical, but the Patrick Stewart 1999 is a close second. If I choose to watch this again next year for some reason, I would watch the 1999 one, Mr. Magoo's and the Muppets, and 1938. Those would be the few that I would watch. Those are my top 4 for sure. Not always for disability reasons, but those are my favorite adaptations. And this finally brings us into the now what portion of this video. Thank goodness. Oh my gosh, we've been here forever. Where I can acknowledge that 44 hours later of A Christmas Carol's, I don't think that I learned anything new about Tiny Tim or saw anything particularly interesting happen with him in any of these versions. At some point I realized I just committed to the bit and I was gonna have to go for it even though nothing was going to happen. I think the primary absolute basic need is to have a more visible and obvious conversation around the trope Tiny Tim created and what that means and how that is an issue. I also think the primary absolute basic need is to cast disabled children as Tiny Tim, and to perhaps say that in the program as a great caveat to explain why this is important and what is going on with this aspect of the story. In my opinion, the biggest problem here at this point is the PR of the story and the character. It's not the character himself. I think in its historical context, it is relatively fine. The issue is now the saturation of this idea and the lack of critical thinking around it, which we can add on to the piece to fix. Were I to direct this, acknowledging that you can technically do whatever you want with the script at this point since it's been in the public domain for forever, but these are specific things I would do within the dramaturgical confines of the original source material. I would want to embody the active little crutch line, so we see Tiny Tim being a normal boy who's trying to jump around with his siblings and be involved rather than just being carried everywhere. That would be a great thing to do. He can be carried from church. That's a long walk on the snow. I support him, but he doesn't need to be lifted throughout the entire house. He can move on his own. It's probably good for his bones to work on that. I want my Tiny Tim running around. I want him playing games. I want him acting like his siblings. I also want to see him be kind of annoyed about having to keep his leg brace on and not having to rest sometimes, and his mom worrying about him so much. I want him to want to be a regular kid. If you're not super familiar with disability, that may seem like a choice that makes it seem like he doesn't like his disability or doesn't like who he is, and I don't mean it to come across that way. It's more that if you've ever worked with disabled children who need to wear mobility aids, hearing aids, any kind of medical aid, if you've ever tried to put glasses on a toddler specifically, but also I briefly spent time in medical school for the deaf, and those kids were throwing their hearing aids everywhere. They did not want them on their bodies. So I do think that that is a way to make him feel more like a kid that will also be relatable to parents in the audience of disabled children who have experienced trying to get their wrangle their child into using their medical aids, because kids don't totally get it. So that's what that change means, not a he doesn't want to be disabled. It's that he doesn't want the extra things that he thinks get in his way, even though they actively help him, because he doesn't understand. His siblings also should not treat him like glass, except for if he falls and then they can all panic, but that's a much better and more authentic familial dynamic, especially with the knowledge of how common disability was at this time. Tim would be a lot more rough and tumble than we allow him to be. I want the moment where Bob tells his wife about the thing Tim said at church about being inspiring to other people to be reacted to less like it's a sweet, wholesome thought he had, and more like, literally, where did the child get that idea from? What weird old lady said something to him in another pew and he took it and is proud of it and is repeating it verbatim. I also wanted to be clear that his God blesses everyone is him just repeating the toast everybody else just gave and getting a lot of praise for saying that, and then he just repeats it every single chance that he gets because he's a child and children do that. And that makes these things seem more like echoed repetition of weird things adults are saying around him rather than like organic thought. And that's going to take away a lot of this weird grew up too fast existentialism of all of these lines. All these things take the existing text and they allow him to do the existing text while also behaving like a normal child. Genuinely, if I were to advocate for any text change at all, it would be to take out the usage of the word cripple. I found that day-to-day people don't really realize cripple is a slur, so the less people hear it utilized ever, the better. Not to mention that for disabled audience members who do know that it is a slur, that word is going to pop out to them in bold and make them feel less comfortable in that space and in that narrative, which does not make the historical accuracy argument worth it at all. We can say that he is frail, we can say that he is weak, we can say that he is sick. Those are all things that are not slurs and are also historically accurate and make our minority folks feel more welcome in our space, so we can make that change very easily. We can also choose to make script changes that better reflect diversity. There were queer people back then, like there are today. It just looked a little different sometimes. Shout out to Trinity Rep, who has made Fred queer on multiple occasions. They've gender bent Fred and they've made Fred lesbian and they've made lots of gender choices, and I really appreciate that. I wish that was done more because it's not done that often. Also, all the spirits are referred to as it in this book, and yet many of the spirits I've seen in adaptations here and just over the years have been deliberately gendered. So let's do something about that. Let's also consciously, don't accidentally make weird class commentary unless you mean to, but let's include people of color. Please, I beg of you. Your Scrooge can walk with a cane if he so desires. This is a historically accurate thing. People did do that on the day-to-day, but maybe let's be a little bit more thoughtful as to whether he's using it as a mobility device or as an aesthetic rich guy thing. I would personally prefer the latter. Let's not do the he needs a mobility aid until he's a good person again, now he's fine thing. That needs to die. There's an interesting paralleling that can be done between his mobility aid and Tiny Tim's mobility aid. All the times that has appeared, that has not been formally done, which feels like a waste. So if you're gonna use a cane, think about it. Imagine a version where Scrooge is so aggressive about keeping the status quo because he is the kind of disabled person who barely made it through the system, and it made him jaded and refusing to help anybody else, because if he can do it, so can everybody else. There's, again, this risk in doing a disabled villain idea, right? But imagine a version of this where, like, institutions weren't really a thing when Scrooge was a child, if we're staying this period. This can also be moved around to other eras, obviously, as a similar concept, but imagining that, like, Scrooge is somewhere in his 40s or a little bit later at the time of the story, there could be a version where he was born deaf and sent to a school for the deaf, something that would have been fairly new at the time, and all his friends go home for Christmas break because most of them are from one of the many English towns where hereditary deafness was common, and so nobody noticed, whereas he was seen as shameful because he couldn't hear and thus more or less abandoned there every single holiday. And then his apprenticeship at Fezziweeks perhaps is in one of those hereditarily deaf places where sign language and speech are used interchangeably, and so, like, that's accessible to him, but he then learns there's more money to be had in the city, even if it means going to a place that is inaccessible to him, where he knows he won't really have access to any community, and his rigidity comes from trying to convince himself he made the right choice and leaving all of that behind. But, like, in seeing Tiny Tim being disabled and loved and cherished and accommodated by his family, this is part of what reminds him that maybe he is miserable, actually, and that he has people in his life who want to make him feel that way too. And that's, like, part of what connects the two of them as kindred spirits, rather than just like, poor disabled child, how sad. And if the story is reframed in a different era, we could, you know, turn Scrooge into more of an institutionalization situation. Perhaps he convinces himself that if he amasses enough money and is left alone, he has at less of a chance of having to be put back there, and that's how he copes with it. Maybe his nephew is also disabled and tries to connect with him over it, but that freaks Scrooge out, so he keeps him at bay, and he keeps Cratchit at bay because he thinks that if Cratchit knows about his disability status, he'll not be taken seriously. There's, like, lots of things that we could be playing with here. But I do think, at the end of the day, the real miracle of Christmas is that after a cumulative over 44 hours of watching and or listening to A Christmas Carol, I both still like it and have more ideas on what to do with it, and would be genuinely happy to work on it if somebody asked me to. As a scholar, I'm not performing in the show. You cannot make me do that. But if next season you want a disability dramaturg for your regional production, let me know. It'd be my pleasure. And with that, do tell me what adaptation is your favorite of this bunch. And also, if I missed any, I can promise you I will not watch any of the ones that I missed, but tell me about them anyway. Also, please tell me what different kinds of Tiny Tims that you've seen around the country, around the world. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Oh, it was really good.